Good afternoon. The Soviet President, Mr. Gorbachev, has left Shannon on his way to Cuba after a meeting with the Taoiseach, which he described as a milestone in Soviet-Irish relations. With him, Mr. Gorbachev takes Mr. Haughey's reassurance that Ireland deeply admires the efforts being made to open up Soviet society and restructure the economy. In spite of fears of bad weather, Mr. Gorbachev and his wife Raisa enjoyed bright sunshine during their visit. Mr. Gorbachev spent almost an hour in talks with Mr. Haughey while his wife visited Banrati Folk Park. They and their party, including Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze, are due to arrive in Cuba at about 8 o'clock this evening. Mr. Gorbachev flew into Shannon just over 2 hours ago for his meeting with Mr. Haughey, and waiting there, Brian O'Connell.
Well, Mr. Gorbachev's plane touched down here at Shannon slightly ahead of schedule, at about 11:25 in fact. The Taoiseach made a short welcoming address. In reply, Mr. Gorbachev emphasised that his visit to Ireland was much more than a stopover. It was, in fact, he said, a milestone. Michael Lally.
It was a bitterly cold Sunday morning, but still bright and sunny, as President Mikhail Gorbachev, accompanied by his wife Raisa, arrived for this historic but brief visit. They were welcomed by the Taoiseach, Mr. Haughey, and the Taoiseach, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Brian Lenihan. The Taoiseach opened his address of welcome in Russian.
President Gorbachev, Madam Gorbacheva, Очень рад, что вы к нам приехали. You are both warmly welcome to Ireland. Mr. President, Ireland, along with the rest of the world, has watched the great changes taking place in the Soviet Union with sympathy and understanding. We deeply admire the efforts you are making to open up Soviet society and restructure the Soviet economic and political system, and we wish you every success in your courageous endeavors.
Then it was the turn of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Уважаемый господин премьер-министр, дамы и господа.
Mr. Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen.
Мы рады вступить на землю Ирландии. Благодарим за теплую встречу и за добрые слова.
We are glad to be here on Irish soil. Thank you for the warm reception and for your kind words.
Ирландия не остановка в пути, а событие. Первая советско-ирландская встреча на высшем уровне будет краткой, но тем не менее, тем важнее каждая минута этой встречи.
In the calendar of our meetings with the leaders of a number of countries to be held this year, Ireland is not a stopover but a milestone. The first Soviet-Irish summit meeting will be brief. The first Soviet-Irish summit meeting will be brief, but that makes every minute of it even more important. Thank you for the attention and for the reception.
After the formalities ended, it was down to the first ever Soviet-Irish summit.
Well, the talks between the two leaders went on slightly longer than had been planned, in fact, and afterwards both men described them as constructive. Our political correspondent, Donald Kelly.
The two leaders and their delegations posed briefly for cameramen before beginning their historic talks. Their agenda covered international affairs, in particular nuclear disarmament, the Middle East, Lebanon and the Irish role in UNIFIL, Soviet-Irish trade and cultural links, and Northern Ireland. Later, Mr. Haughey told newsmen the talks had been stimulating, and he announced a ministerial mission to Moscow.
We have agreed that on a number of issues of bilateral importance,
Мы согласились по поводу некоторых важных проблем,
that these will be followed up at official and ministerial level,
что будет дальше развитие в уровне министерства,
and that in particular a delegation of Irish ministers
и что делегация ирландских министров
will travel to Moscow to pursue further detailed negotiations and discussions on a number of the issues that we have raised.
At the press conference, Mr. Gorbachev gave his views on the Northern Ireland problem through his interpreter.
Well, first of all, our philosophy is that this question has to be addressed by, first of all, the people. There is a human dimension to that problem, and we respond to that human dimension. We are sympathetic to efforts to resolve that problem, in a way consistent with the feelings of the people of Northern Ireland. So it is for the Irish people to address that problem. On the other hand, we leave that problem to the government of Great Britain to discuss. We did not have any practical discussion of the problem itself in these negotiations. On the other hand, there is a human dimension, a human aspect to that problem which was mentioned.
Well, while the Taoiseach and Mr. Gorbachev were having their talks here at Shannon, Mrs. Raisa Gorbachev, accompanied by Mrs. Haughey and Mrs. Lenihan, travelled to nearby Bunratty for a 40-minute walkabout. Jim Fahey.
Mrs. Gorbachev, taken to see a piece of Ireland's historic past reconstructed in the 19th century folk village, astonished her host by launching into a rapid-fire series of questions about all aspects of Irish life, contemporary as well as historic. It was made clear to the Soviet First Lady that what she was seeing was all a very far cry from the Ireland of the 20th century. But it didn't deter her from asking all about Irish lifestyles, the kind of houses people live in, and even the weather. In hugely good-humoured fashion, she pressed on through the milling media pool for a particularly amusing encounter with one of the Midwest's best-known characters, Pat Crowe. It was about as near as the smiling First Lady would come to the real Ireland. And to the delight of the International Press Corps, he wished Mrs. Gorbachev a happy holiday and God's blessing. For Irish tourist chiefs, it was a dream occasion as TV crews from all over Europe followed every sunshine smile. Security was tight but discreet throughout the 40-minute visit.
I've been happy to see a small piece of island. The Emerald Island.
Jim Fahey reporting there. Well, Mr. Gorbachev's plane left here over half an hour behind schedule en route for Havana, where he's due at about 8 o'clock this evening. Now back to Don Cockburn in Dublin.
Thank you, Brian. On an historic day in Irish-Soviet relations, that's it from the newsroom for the moment. A reminder that we'll have more on Mr. Gorbachev's visit in extended news programmes at 6:15 and at 9 o'clock. Do svidaniya.